所以叫那老将就不，就是些大概些也节做那些这老边界三节主，说三节吃到所以叫那老将就不多当年就是大概些也节做那些这老边界三节主，我三节吃到所以叫那老将就不多当年就是。基金一月错难节，这老边节三节主，说老大老面没咱们起用不得，解决了是解决了，吃饱吃饱的三节生活都是些特别聚了就把这解决特别亲切今天的人，这家庭原来人家所谓的就把亲戚吃饱得了，就是在那个也第二个人家是这就是有没，俺比当年的我退了，对外孙女也那么他也可当了，当的也个这不得当没可能。这我估计长龙其实我特别感觉大概天天都，看给我点就那么我没把你的生意，因为上面这边面的拉家杂路，我那是他看说的，那人前面过的了是吧？你看是，马里比领导给朗多这边没对不对？马里比领导给朗多这边没对不对？东安人的话这边七级落个6月是吧？你东安家说对了的，那把滚到下面的，七级今年请完了，就把今年进门就是今年我说那些今年是吧？我看着是啥呢？马里比领导给朗多这边没得谁干了，俺那个朗多今年没写吧的，马里比明白这呢，朗多今年没写吧，朗多这边写了没写吧，朗多今年了忙把人上，俺那东安气气，东安人到了这边，东安气气吧怎么了？俺那到了这呢。我这待会儿真的，俺那天都别做切呗，俺那他东安街上现在都有夸早晚的没把一张，俺那东安街家族地啦是的，俺那3000年的一碰破的东安街家族是跟把的，是吧？3000年的一碰破的了东安街家族是的，家族了他没把那些3000年的一碰破太了样，俺那他没把。东安家做对了呢，可是东安家做对了呢，那把跟着太原买的，他没吧，是吧？俺那他说的，他没太阳，俺那让给，俺那东安街让新多钱呢，俺那东安街这个就这么的，俺那东安是，他说的3把钱马着呢，俺那别说去马钱呢，俺那他没太阳买吧。是吧？我听人家东安家说对了，等那么跟着去年请完了，就把其他进门就谁干了？我在听着我的，那通过的联系间，他看上看你们希望那些东安街上写了马代把人家。我大家说的东安街上新的7年，东安了谈这个了这个呀。
Now, as it says at the beginning of the introduction to the great treatise on the stages of the path by J. Rinpoche, it says that when one is blinded by the cataracts of ignorance and sunk into darkness, and this is in reference to the ignorance which doesn't understand what is to be gotten rid of and what is to be taken up, then this ocean of samsara is beginningless and endless. And it's only through understanding that which is to be taken up and abandoned that one is able to gain the wisdom that enables us to become free from this condition of samsara. So what this indicates then is, as we've said previously, is that samsara, which is the 5 aggregates which have been taken up, appropriated through the force of karma and mental affliction, and thus are engaged in contamination or contaminated, those aggregates are beginningless and in principle endless, at least until some proper antidote to them is applied. So at the beginning, while we're in a samsaric state and we simply don't understand what we ought to do and what we ought to avoid, the things that we should take up and practice, the things that we should get rid of, then it's as if we have cataracts and we're blind to being able to know what is to be done. And then as a result of that, we're sunk into this ocean of samsara. So just like the aggregates are beginningless, just like the ocean is essentially limitless in its extent, depth and breadth, then similarly it's something that we can't see the bottom of or the edge of if we're sunk in the middle of it. Then this samsara is just like that. It's beginningless and endless as long as we're laboring under the ignorance which doesn't understand what is to be done and what's to be avoided. So it's only when we're samsaric beings we misapprehend that which is of the nature of suffering as if it was the nature of happiness, and that is what perpetuates the entire samsaric condition. So this verse then continues by saying, please enable me to be able to understand that which gain the basic nature of the Dharma, which is understanding what is to be gotten rid of and what is to be taken up. Gaining that kind of wisdom, once one has that, then one is able to discriminate between what one ought to do and what one ought to avoid, and that is the only means to achieve real peace and liberation. Otherwise, any kind of endeavor that we're involved in, all the effort that we make and whatnot, is futile because it's simply perpetuating the process of samsara, and will continue endlessly until we apply the proper countermeasures to that.
Oh yeah, then that 가서 토메타 메스 아니 타메타 어 타메타 아니 사변 통다 메바다 메스바니 시다통 지신 템바 통와에 이제 코비 치다 통소 안에 사변라 아니 토메타 메바 사변이 dindi지니 총사하게 이 사변도 지나 통다 메바 사변이 메스바나나 아니 사변 그 치다 통와나 신신 아니 사실 얘네기 풍분대양 아 토마타 된대지니 총아래 세나 다 지마정장하면 오동오동어서 토마타 매봐 토마타 유나 아니 김에 개방야나 미디미 드라마도 좋아 매봐 다 사실 얘네기 풍분 되게 주 아니 내다 녀모 그 왕근에서 자와야 단지 말해봐 나중에 말이 바라니 뭐 다음에 또 비셔럽 다음에 또 비셔럽 때라 파네 된다면 다음에 셔럽 또 비셔럽 요 컴박 제발라 아니 단지 말이 바게 친다제 통회 주 단지 말이 바 세배 저부 사제 내기 풍보대 세버 좋아 인상 어디디 담바다 거기 친다 통화 되는 바래 어디 된다위 아니 거기 친다 용안이와 시비니 시 토발라 아니 다음에 비트 때라 뺄거해 남의 배태된라 배발랑내라 대시그 코아주비 림바탄 도비 림바태다라 아니다 가소래 랑기 태외 땡라 팔데 아니 코아주도 그 림바 시니 아니 시원나 시잖아요 랑가 냠소 레네 탈 아니다 어 가소래 타바주바게 람데다 고문고와 인자 아니다 대시대나 바게 아니 좋은데 세냐 바게 아니 그노그저 그런 바나 내가 사다데 삼바쇼.
Now then, when we say that samsara is beginningless, that we can say categorically, but when we say it is endless, that has to be qualified. Because, for example, if we take, for example, a grain, a seed of grain, there's no first point in time that continuity of the causality that gave rise to that seed of grain originated. The causality preceding it, prior seed of grain and so on back, that stream of causality is completely beginningless. However, if, for example, that seed of grain was burned, then it would be the continuity of that causality would be ceased, and it wouldn't have the ability to or power to produce a subsequent seed of grain. So the same thing applies to the continuity of samsara. Samsara is beginningless. There's no first point in time at which it started. So these contaminated aggregates which are taken up through the force of karma and mental affliction, the stream of causation which gave rise to them is is without any kind of beginning. There's no way to see a beginning to that. However, and it will continue into the future indefinitely unless the proper countermeasure to it is applied. So here the samsara, the contaminated aggregates which have been taken up by the force of karma and mental affliction, they don't arise without some kind of cause, and they don't arise without some inappropriate kind of cause which could produce them. So they are caused, and they come about due to specific causes. So if we're able to identify and eliminate the cause which gives rise to samsara, the mental affliction, the contaminated aggregates, then the continuity of samsara can be ceased. So that's what we're studying here, is how is it that we can bring about the cessation of samsara, the end of it. And if we, as it's being expressed in this text, if we examine it carefully, then samsara, the contaminated aggregates, arise from contaminated karma and mental affliction. And likewise, karma and mental affliction themselves arise from the basic mental affliction of the misconception of the self, or a misapprehension of self, and misapprehending the self as being intrinsically existent or established by its own intrinsic nature, something like that. So when we understand that that there's a basic fundamental cause which gives rise to the samsara, the contaminated aggregates, and we understand that application of that antidote, the correct understanding of the nature of reality, and particularly understanding the selflessness of things, when we apply that to the misconception of the self, then we can eradicate it completely. That in turn would produce the stoppage of that causality, such that the other mental afflictions won't arise. Contaminated karma, which is impelled by the mental afflictions, will cease, and then thus eventually the arising of the contaminated aggregates will also cease. So that will produce then the peace, which is the separation from or cessation of the origination of the contaminated aggregates. When we understand it in that way, we can see that samsara, we can understand samsara correctly, understand its source or origination, understand that there is a cessation to it, and likewise understand that there's a method by which one can bring about that cessation, the correct understanding of selflessness. And that's what the topic is, the subject matter which is being presented here. So again, as usual, we should set our motivation correctly, thinking about those subjects that we've just gone over, and then think, in order to achieve perfect Buddhahood, I need to listen to this teaching on the Four Noble Truths in order to achieve liberation as a means to achieving perfect Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings, as we normally set the motivation when listening to teachings like this.
Oh yeah, that didn't the Kasan Tizumare, she them the Mashua de Zena, that I get someone to and roll a pension, but number the shit of the Chataro, Tagala, Lunjuga Kauso, and that. Oh yeah, that. And you castle, Tuji Chimocomba, Tombala, and they say the job at that the deep to Sima. Even you took a jump in the church. 저더니지 좁아니 인데 안에 다 가서를 탈람스바 탈친비 덤비다래 탈람스바 탈친지 라니기 탈람스바 탈친지 라니기 탈람시다를 스비 람테니 안에 두자가 랜다 잡아서라 믿대봐 안에 셴라 치지 말라 봐 송아 잡히지 다 가서래 라니지 람 아니 바시바 타치바데 가르레 세레가라 아니 셰셰셰와라 파도 제제기 아니 드바스 트마세바 세베체레스 라와시 셰셰셰와라 파도 제제기 트마세바 파이시 세바 파이시 데 데셰레 쪼바 쪼바 유비 추담바 인세大起码没住呢，是起码是把半月去，大起码没住进来。我那闲了，他们中学家没送俺，七级老都送俺，但他们中学家没送俺，现在没送，现在他们没得把的，但他们送把的这些主机给人，这些主机给他们推给，短把给点了，俺的这些主机话也上，现在俺都起码了把短把给主管也在推给主给的，我这些主机的短把下半年去出不来是，俺的七级老子说呢。치마다나 코랑 그 치지 말로바 쏨바양 로명 코랑 그 치지 말로바 쏨바 로명 오라 치지로 소와르베스 그래서 라니 치지로도 쏨셰바 카리스 라니 그 안에 치지로도 담바데 셰바 대니 카레스 투와체 다 가오랑 그 치지 말로바 쏨바 로명 오라 치지로 소와르스나 담보 밑에 바데 교육 주제라 대시 주반지 주스 저와기 주세래 아니 가서 대시 주반이지 교육 주제 대시 주반이지 내가 셔봐 사대 빵바 대화 셔와당 아니 다 가서 아니 또바 대화 셔와니 아니 갑견지를 빵방 레바 빵마리바 빵마 라미도 빵마당 레바 두지 감다 사바치 아니 켜바다 레바 켜바 되게 달라 두그래 야
Now, so previously, then we've gone through the forward progression of teaching the proof of how the Buddha is an authoritative person, a person who's become an avenue of valid cognition or an authority, as particularly as regards to the means by which one achieves liberation. And so that's shown that by establishing great compassion, that the Buddha has great compassion, that therefore he can become a teacher by showing that he is a teacher by understanding the Four Noble Truths and especially selflessness, how to teach them to others. He's the Sugata, and by virtue of that, he's also the savior as well. So that shows in the forward progression how these five epithets establish the Buddha as an authority with respect to the subject that's being taught here, the Four Noble Truths. Now, someone might question then whether or not the Buddha teaches the means to liberation in the correct fashion, and that's where we've arrived at in the text, which is at the top of page 336 in the translation, near the top of 216 in the Tibetan. And it says, someone might say, well then it might be argued that the Buddha either does not teach the path to liberation to others at all, or he teaches it distortedly or in an erroneous fashion. The first is unacceptable, can't be accepted because this has been proven by the explanation that the fact that he's a teacher proves that he is the Sugata. So by the fact that he's achieved understanding of selflessness and is able to teach it also shows that he is a Sugata who's achieved those abandonments and freed from all of the defects as described earlier. If the second alternative was the case, then either one, the Buddha claims or pretends to teach these things undistortedly, but in fact understands things or entities in a distorted fashion, or two, he desires to teach distortedly. And the first alternative there is unacceptable, which has been proven already by the proof that shows that the fact that he is the Sugata proves that he is the Savior, the last of the 5 epithets there. So if the second alternative of those two was the case, then either the Buddha would be like a bad doctor that is attached to himself or to his self, and is perplexed as to whether he can accomplish his own aims, own desires, or B, he would not possess a great compassion that has others as its intentional object. A is already been proven to be unacceptable because it's been presented in the previous proofs where it shows the teacher is one who understands reality and especially selflessness without any kind of mistake. And then the second alternative is also unacceptable, which has been proven already by setting forth great compassion as the reason proving that he is the teacher. So his wish to benefit other beings, which was proven earlier, shows that he has the quality of being the teacher that teaches selflessness correctly.
Oh yeah, that's it. That's the Oma Terra Anita Rani Chilo, soon Sheba in Nas, Chilo, Damba Deba in Sana, Rani Chilo, Damba Deba in Sanat, Chamatella, member Nambatar. Rangil Rala Chane, and the round the Madu to Rang Deba Maduberg Tope Wangi, Reve. Yana Shala maybe Tavani Shaba maybe Reves, or Tavani Chevy. That member Nambata Rala Chane, Rang Deba Madubu to Toba my body, that touching Komana Shane, Duchangama, the Shig to Glory, or the Carriers, Bamba de Sheta Toba de Shini Woki, or Tigi, I need to cancel it. New Manja Teta Pawa Tele, Ama made a body to Shangamana Tandam. Chima made a body, Damba Ducheto. Dembi Duchi to Javani Chimba by the Mayende, and you called the Damba Dubi Kala, Duchi Tuja Comla Te, Segala, and Javani Yokombala Dene, and it Damba Duba Tigi, and it took to grace.
So therefore, again, these last two cases where someone could claim that or misconceive the Buddha as being like a bad doctor who is selfish and is confused as to whether or not he could even achieve his own aims, or someone who is as if the Buddha was someone who was who did not possess great compassion that has others as an intentional object. These are both unacceptable. The first because as given in the previous proofs, where showing that the Buddha is the Sugata who has gotten rid of all of the things that are to be abandoned, has achieved those 3 kinds of abandonments, as well as showing that he has gotten rid of, has gained all of the kinds of actualizations or realizations in a positive sense of the path. Those show that he is neither attached to the self nor confused about the achievement of his own objectives. And then the second one, showing that the Buddha has great compassion, is one who desires to help the world, shows that he's not someone who doesn't have that kind of compassion, which has all sentient beings as his object when he's engaged in his activities.
Oh yeah. That didn't do anything else, but they mentioned that Zim soon said that you buy inside that done, Honda shall be between them Tena, and the Jim then the church, tell them to buy Chigi Lotus Musundi, Teta Sumbala, Rala de Goyame, and then Shala de Jang, and then Digi do me about Muslim to ship said, Rana Shan Kala de Jang, and do me about the Muslim to ship said. 我兄弟大概都被主席当，俺那等把他推荐你去主席等把人喏，他论中搞开是吧？等把人喏，等把确实你去随便他们现在亲戚马路把送把在的，我是老那么多。老于他们就告诉，没大把他当面说，俺那我们 아니 좀바꾼 가래를 좀바꾼 시간아 다 미다버라 다음에 봐서 공부하기 아니 배서 샤워꾼 아란데도 많이 봐 신심제 탐제도 점쟁이 태도 조심 공부 잡아라 아니 되게 탈치면 싫어서 공부 잡았더니 탈치면 싫어 네 덤발래 대시주비 수단 말에서 나랑도냐 진짜 대시주비 대지 좀바꾼现在的教育局在那开始不到，如果咱们今年告诉当没把当，那咱们没打算记住了说啊，俺那打算就为什么做我讲，光把他们家，俺那现在的教育局在有的，俺老那么多什么家他们家了没别，这我情报单单把听意思啊，都是推荐空来的是个了什么家了没别，这我情报单单把听，他情报这边写的是
So then, therefore, the Muni or sage, the Buddha, does not teach the path to liberation falsely or distortedly or erroneously, because he directly sees, that directly means with like perception, not just like through inference or something like that, rather with direct perception, sees that in teaching thus, he will bring about no desirable result. He will bring about no desirable result regarding either his own aims or others' aims. So it's not that. I think it should be undesirable result, maybe. Undesirable result regarding either his own aims or others' aims. Those verses prove that he is the Savior and shows, and this part of the text shows that Savior is the predicate of the two reasons, teacher and compassionate one. So in terms of establishing a proof here, you take the the Savior, the last of the five epithets, as the predicate, and the Buddha is the Savior, and then teacher, the third of the five epithets, and compassionate one, the second of the five epithets, are used as the reasons which establish that predicate being the Savior with respect to the Buddha. Then, so this is showing how those different components in the string of epithets function together to establish the Buddha as the authoritative person. The sage undistortedly teaches others the path to liberation. He has seen by himself, because earlier on the path of training, the earlier part of the path before he actualized Buddhahood, all meditative undertakings regarding impermanence, no self, etc., were applied towards the aims of all of the sentient beings. And this comes from the fact that he developed great compassion for all of the sentient beings initially as a follower of the Mahayana, and then gained those, did all the meditations and so forth regarding impermanence, no self, etc., with the aims of others in mind, not his own selfish aim in mind. And he has completed the conditioning or accustomation of those. And this shows the manner by which we can prove the Buddha to be a Sugata, the one who's achieved gone to bliss or well gone, from the fact that he is the teacher, that he has applied himself to those meditative developments of the understanding of selflessness and the other aspects of the Four Noble Truths.
Oh yeah, that didn't tend the Tujil number to be two and those that and the Tada Ludi Lunjunga Gabdo Lunjunga Gabde, Joade, Daji to Cheche, Joan to Chela, and a deshe Mama Desheta, Toba Deshenio. Deshe to Jedela, Joadame to be shut up, Combalatena, Joadame to be shut up, Combe, and a deshe to by the dam. Joadame to be shut up town. 아니 가래를 통발에 sana 자원인지 쇼고 고마라. 인자 이 루중에까지 저와 따지 두자前呢 显示为什么就个呀显示为什么就这个这些저와 두자个这些두자 그 담바 두자 그 아니 두자 투지 자원인지 거라 타투비 루제 도지 첨보이 루제데 아니 자와 타투비 루제 자와데 아니 다 이제 첨보 임바탕 참을 참미주 주비 시도 남라 림지 주바나 아니 대신 통모만 비 남라 당부 주비 주고 다지지 뭐 참미주 주비 시도 하나 산제주 공부特别 시도 저 덤바라니지 예비게 공부한테 特别 시도 남라 림지 주바나 당부特别 特别 전부 통모만 비 남라 주비 주고 다 semjeche 야,如果대 semje 개발라 내라 저와 니지 셔보고 이장 탑단 두제지 니지 셔보 임배 아니 두제 투제 콤레테세 다디 두제 투제 시 투제 투제 두제 이대 대바자도
Now then, there's also the reason why all undertakings were applied towards the aim of others, proof for that, because earlier on the training path, he was in complete possession of the great compassionate mind that has as its object or intentional object all sentient beings. So this shows the way of proving the Buddha as the teacher from the fact that he is compassionate. So compassionate, being the compassionate one, established is the evidence or proof that the reason that establishes him as the teacher. And then the text continues. Therefore, in this section on the forward system, Savior is made as the predicate of the reason, and the other three epithets, that is, the Sugata, teacher, and compassionate one, are proven in succession. So this shows the chain of inference that is made so as to establish the person as the authoritative being by virtue of being the savior, and then the other three prior to savior are used as the evidence or reasons that are used to establish those in succession, in sequence. Compassion is the ultimate proof, and so compassion is the second of the 5 epithets or terms for the Buddha there, and so that's the final or ultimate evidence or proof that's used. And when one enters the path gradually in order to become an authoritative person, a person who is a means of valid knowledge or authority, then that is the threshold for first entering the uncommon Mahayana path. So this is on page 338 of the translation. Since great compassion is the method and the proof, Dharmakirti shows compassion by as the proof or the thing which establishes all of the sort of the key link within the chain of inferences that are presented here by the words compassion is the establisher.
오야 다디 계기 안에 가서 투제 된지 좀 그냥 현지턴도 조치로 대지 차인 군전태는 차진 참아인 세르가나 되나 대다 군에 눈조를 봐 대다라 때네 안에 좀봐 참아 주바니 대체제 저와 되냐라 때네 참이 주고 인데 저와 되냐라 탈람 때문에 고네 아니 잡자지 스시지바다 잡자지 저희네가 탈침바 임베시 좀 면에나 잡지 차니 마산라 잡 메세나네 잡죠 고야 미주베스 다좀 받들 테니까 좀 면에나 잡지 차니 마산 마임바 잡임바 좀 네바 잡 메세나네 잡죠 고야 미주베 아니 잡죠나요 고와 미주바 인자 좀 받들라 군이가 상황 좀 미워탕 안에 가서 잡죠 거와 주바니가 상황 좀 받들라 군이가 상황을 쳐봐이노
Now then, so from all of the above, then this establishes that the Buddha is the one who has become an authority, who has become a person who serves as a means of valid cognition or avenue of correct knowledge. And the root text here is thus he is an authority or a means of valid cognition. And so what that means then is thus the sage is an authority person, a person who is a means of valid cognition with regard to for those who are intent on freedom or liberation, and those who wish liberation or freedom. Because through showing the path to liberation to those who are intent on freedom, he has become their savior. So that's the final one of the 5 epithets there, the savior. And he has complete ability to save them. So it's got to have both of those factors. If he cannot save them, then he does not fulfill the definition of a savior. And if he does not save them, he does not accomplish what is needed by those seeking salvation or liberation. So in this teacher, both the ability and necessity meet. What that refers to there is that the teacher, to be a teacher in the sense of a means of a person who has an avenue of valid cognition or for the path to liberation, both the ability to teach and the sort of need or that the teacher necessarily does teach have to come together, because if either of those, both ability and motivation in effect, have to come together, because if either of those are absent, then that person would not be a teacher in the sense of a means of valid cognition that's able to show one authoritatively the path to liberation.
다디 전에 다야기 루종을 권에 참미 좀 참미 되고 주주자 루다 도비 권에 참미 주부 주수 이예변하네. 와 군제 시시지 루종을 권에 군제 계지 그 주면 볼까be 권에 루종 그 샤바 자와당 루종 그 샤바다 군제 시시지 주면 보고 시시 그 주면 볼 로도가 비치도 아니 룬도 그 샤바데 샤바 인자다 룬도 그 샤바데라 제주 대장 아마네 치마 주비 추당 대다 꿀라 참마 주비 수세 다 루중서 좀 과도 샤바 나신 아니 가서래 주지 투지 콤라세 세가 세와나 시전에 저완이지 전부 콤발라 덤발라 대시래 줘봐라 아니 덤비덤바 참마 주바지 다 루는 도바 세가라 아니 줘와라 한번 줘와 주미 줘와 아니 줘와라 아니 줘위 원도 아니 대신 원도 상아 대신라 대방 원도 상아 덤발래 아니 저완이 치봉 원도 상아 니 아니 제다 임바리 제비다 도치 강이자 도시 제가 룰라 도바 세트 임바리 대통도와 담보라 줘위랑 신 주바 세 좋아 시시등을 좋아 주바데 그래 좋이자래 대생우도 소화 안도 대세당 또 대세다 방바 대세는 것도 소화죠 대세게 달래 대래 아니 저 담에도 베시라고 방도 소화돼죠 저 담에도 베시라고 온도 좀 담에도 베시라래 아니 자와 투지셔 방도 주바데 온도 소화돼 도스를 거야.
Now, so that concludes in the discussion, the presentation in that portion of the text of this forward progression of these epithets, how we establish the teacher has become a means of valid cognition or a person of authority who is qualified and motivated to teach the path to liberation. Now, and that's done by in the forward progression by establishing him as a person who has developed great compassion, has a wish to benefit the world of living beings. That's established through determining that he is the teacher. That's in turn established through showing that he is the sugata, and then finally that is established through showing that he is a protector, showing those in that forward sequence of inference. Now, there's the reverse procedure reverse process of establishing the teacher as a person who has become a means of valid cognition or an authority is first we establish that the Buddha is the savior, and then from that, or the chain of causality that, or a chain of inference that is employed here is called a chain of inference which is based on causality. So by taking the savior as the effect, we then determine what is the cause of that effect. The cause is being a sugata, and likewise, what is the cause of being a sugata? It is being the teacher in the sense of these epithets. Then what is it that makes him the teacher as an effect? The cause of that is the having that compassion, which is the wish to benefit the world. So the reverse sequence is establishing the Buddha as a means of valid cognition through first establishing him being the protector, then that he's the sugata through the achievement of all of those his achievements at that level, and then the teacher, then the great compassion in that reverse order.
Oh yeah, that tambo de shi ne lu rawang de joba juba tela. Jubi ran shi kare re sana. Ani demba shi ne lu chi ji ma lo ba. Rawang do domba zebe. Ani joba demba, jomde de joba demba. Ani dembi sura ju ten den la baba che sa je ni chan ne. Da tambo de lu jung gi dembi teta khondu shaba na shi teta lu jung gi demba lam khan ne shi ba ge chu demba le. 다 된디 너도 가죠 아니다 저기 루루라 또 배고나 다디 초된 발에 야나 좀 담바신이 된자 봐 세다 디임바래 야나 좀 담바신이 된자 봐 세다 남들 자와게 예자 가서래 초된 바 테레 루중거 가서 아니 담바 참이 주바 테레 양나 다 시바 시비 시제 된지배 다 대화를 시바的现在 시비 아니 주주게 된了봐봐라 대시 된了봐고 연장 시바 시비 시제 이게 된지 양다 루도 그 관에 대셔와고 양나 좀 담바신이 된자 봐고 투바 좀 된데 저와 되니 줘봐 인데 다 다시 나셔래 다 저와 되니라 대신에로 치지 말아 봤다 봐봐 탈치비셔
Now, so this topic here is subdivided into multiple subtopics, and the first of these is showing, as mentioned, demonstrating through the reverse system, through the inversion of the 5 epithets, that he has arrived at such a goal of being, goal here being a person of authority or a person who is an avenue of valid cognition. This is subdivided into the way in which we establish or prove the special dharmas in the translation, that it means special features or qualities, from the latter to the former, and the way of proving all of those that the Buddha is an authority. The first of these is subdivided into 2. This reverse process of chain of inferences, proving that the Buddha has the nature of being a savior, and then there's subdivisions from that that'll come as we go along. And then the first of these is subdivided into showing that he is a savior by showing independently the actuality or reality of the Four Noble Truths, meaning that by showing that the Four Noble Truths are reality, establishing them in their own right, that can be used as evidence to demonstrate that the Buddha is the savior. And then the second part of that is establishing the Four Noble Truths that are the object of the scriptural teaching. So the first topic here is a demonstration of the Four Noble Truths themselves as evidence for the fact that he is the Savior. The verse there says, alternatively, this is alternatively referring to the reverse sequence of the establishing the Buddha as an authoritative person or person of avenue of valid cognition. He is the Savior because he teaches the Four Noble Truths. So then the commentary then at the bottom of 338 continues saying, having shown by the forward system the way in which the teacher proceeded to liberation via some path, or this specific path, we must show alternatively through the reverse system the perfect or correct reasons that demonstrate that he proceeded thus to liberation. The sage, the blessed one, or Bhagavan, is the savior for those intent on freedom, because for those intent on freedom, he is the one who completely teaches unerringly or undistortedly the actuality or the reality of the Four Noble Truths.
Oh yeah, that temba surab ji ten deshi ten la baba tela niwa, ane that temba shi chi ten dang, ane de shung ge ten dang, ce dan zhen yu guan de temba qi ge yi yu yin de chi ten dang ya la ge yi che, da tang bu da temba shi ge chang ye, ane ko rim chen xi dang te, ane chen xi de ten ge ji ge chen ma. 나 담바시 가서래 장애를 가려래 해서 다 타바 되니 기대라 앞지 쪼대是吧 차원도 그 동안 여러 시바 그 타바 전도 인간 그 때라 앞지 쪼대 가려래 저니 코와당 양알래 대와 와 코주비를 받아 아니 고도비를 많이 외인장 코와당 양알래 뒤비 아니 양알래 대외 뒤비 초니스 장애라是코주비를 받아 도비를 많이 장애라是吧 코주비를 받아라야 코와라야 뒤비를 받아 코와라야 주 친지 그 친지 사제년이 코로와 시와네 안에 사제년이 풍부들이 동화코와 제 풍부 세대고 말하는 풍부들 어때 코와라야 네 주친지지 아니 군중 담바세 군중 담바세대 아니 주 풍부들 계지 그 레다니 뭐니 어디다 말을 통거리 주친지 군중 담바탕 레우칭바 아니 유텔라 때는 준비 아니 사장님이 풍부로 양식 7만 년 전에 징박이 아니 저 징바 동아지 때만 있으네 이러와 근데지 많이 있으네 주비를 받더라 고원 주제기 주대라 군주체 아니 주비 레우대라 동아 때바체 남자라 세대 고원 도비를 받 남바 참아 남바 참아 코와라 초와 뭐 코와라 도바 코와라 초위 탑대 탑주대 가르에서나 다 람지 대바 코와 지지 그 주대 당정 마르바 인장 당정 메르바 무슨 세제들라 다음에 또 배셔라 코와 인장 코와라 초와를 치바게 탑주 람지 대바 람지 대바 되게 당장 말을 바게 아니 코라 제지 그 당장 말을 발라 내가钱네 당장 말을 바빠네 차와 고바 토바 인장 아니 남지 대바 초비 제보 고비 대바 이송에 왜 코와 주도 그 군대지 원도 채나야 대바 시장 거래.
Now this has multiple subtopics too. This establishment of the Four Noble Truths, which are the object, content, one could say, of the scriptural teaching. This is divided into the general meaning and the meaning of the different parts of it, limbs of it. The general meaning has first determination of the number, the establishment of the actual number of the Four Noble Truths, then the sequence of them, and then some illustrations of those or examples of those, and then the valid cognition or authority that ascertains this. First of those has ascertaining the number of the Four Noble Truths. So the chief matters to be established for those intent on freedom are ascertained ascertained to be classified into two sides or categories. So that of samsara and that of nirvana. So samsara here refers to the process by which one is involved in samsara, engages in samsara. So samsara here refers specifically to the five aggregates, the aggregates which have been taken up by contaminated karma and mental affliction. And as well as within that, then there's also the cause which gives rise to them, which is contaminated karma and mental affliction. And within that, particularly the misconception or misapprehension of the self, conceiving of a real self or intrinsically existent self. And so that's on that side. And then the other side is the side of purification, and the side of purification encompasses nirvana, the cessation of suffering, as well as the path to cessation of suffering. So it's ascertained that within samsara there are the two, the truth of origination, which is the binding cause, or one could say the cause of being bound within the samsaric condition of having the five aggregates which are contaminated, and then the truth of suffering, which is the bondage, the state of bondage, which is the result of that. So the truth of origination, again, is referring to the contaminated karma and mental afflictions, but particularly at the root of that is the misconception or misapprehension of the self, misapprehending it, misconceiving a self as being real, and then the truth of suffering is the outcome of that. Within purification and there's sort of two sides of it. The samsaric side, the side of contamination, and then the side of purification, side of contamination, or being completely afflicted is another way to gloss that, is referring to the samsaric side as well as its cause. And then the side of purification refers to the truth of path. Path here refers particularly to the wisdom which understands selflessness, and which is the causal method that frees one from samsara, and the truth of cessation, which is the essential result of freedom, the liberation from that. And because these have been ascertained in that way, the cause and result of entering or leaving samsara can be determined to be fourfold. That is, the number, just sheer number of these things is definitively four, because it's subdivided into the two sides, the process of being engaged in samsara and entering into samsara, and the process of getting out of it, turning away from it. Those are, each of those two parts are twofold, so altogether then you have four.
Oh yeah, that is Changai de Shen. That is Korum la Carre Sana, Korum de la Anacuna 20 ribu want to Chavadan, Vijangova Topi ribu want to Chavani Yawari. Junde 20 ribu want to Chana said, Junior Wutang, Judan Jabuni Yizang, Junga la Shana, Jabu Chile, their Chava Yinzang, Jude 20 ribu Wari. Isn't there 20 ribu want to Chana? Junde 20 ribu want to Chana, Kwan Jubi Ju, Gujungdang. Kwan dobi ju lamde yinzang, gujunda lamde yi wode nga la shene. Di yu je la, ane kwan dobi, kwan jubi dewu dunga dang, kwan dobi dewu kwada yi wode chi la ten tenpa de, jude tenji rinpe wantu chawa de shen. Rawa ju nyi nga la tena. Judan lamda dunga dang, kwa wala ni korum shi yin sin. Ane, tanda wando jela tersunga rawa, yawo ten tiri. Ane da, Vijangova Tobi Rimba want to say the Karasa, that Nanju Jila, and it Tobaki Kadula Kandiki Sana, Tambo Dunga Jirashinto. Vijangova Tobi Rimba Tumba Kurmi, Shen to Temba Chade, said 고름 신도 땜바체데 디다 토마 아니 사장님이 풍부디 동아지 땜바데 동아지랑 신도 시와체 동아지랑 신도 시디가나 아니 동아 미대바단데와 대바랑 신도 여바 인자 동아 메데나 아니 동아지 줄라 뽕데结果 현장 아니 동아지 제라 아니 군중체 자 군중 군중 비제라 아니 대제라 가서 이게 관주비를 먹게 와서 쳐왔지 다 동아 대제소 아니 군중나 차외 차와 고방도 쳐와 사장님이 이 풍부 가서 군중나 차외 차왕 고방도 쳐네 고방도 차지지 람 아니 담도 베셔라데 람제에 대해가 다도 세가라 가서 유정어부터 비 고바다 람데 토마코와 지단 체자기 예미라 300권에 코치 지체자 아니 동아 축사바 체자기 동아 가래서나 아니 동아 계사바 아니 미 동아 제가 나서 다도 쉬어와 어디도 마서 내려와 삼내가라 아니 텔라 단대지 로제바 쳐거데스 대마소나 대원도 마소나 뒤줄라 본데 좀 미스비셔로.
Now then, as far as the order of the Four Noble Truths, it says if this teaching were based on the objective succession, or one could just say the sequence, their real sequence, the way they actually occur in sequence, then the truths of origination and path would be taught prior to the truth of suffering and cessation. That is, first you would have origination, then you would have suffering, then you would have path, and then you would have cessation, because that's the sequence in which these things objectively or actually occur in terms of their causal order. That is, the cause necessarily precedes the effect, so origination would come prior to suffering, and path as the means by which cessation occurs would be taught prior to the cessation as such. However, in this case, the truths are taught in the opposite order because this is the sequence which accords with this succession in which they are cognized by a subject, i.e. that is the truth of suffering, origin, cessation, and path. Now, so what this is referring to is that when a yogi or yogini practitioner who is meditating on these things comes to understand them, it's translated as cognized, but one could say realized how these things are, first of all, conceptually understood, and then through perception realized by someone who is meditating upon them. So how that would occur, then it goes in the sequence as it's given traditionally, with first suffering, then origination, then cessation, and then path. And so the reason this is given in that sequence is because that's the sequence in which one understands them and then realizes them directly. So, through initially thinking of the general and particular disadvantages of samsara, one must generate the mind that desires to be free from that, because if that desire does not come first, it is impossible that there will arise the desire to abandon the cause of that, the cause of suffering. So, again here, without understanding what suffering is, which is actually the result, one couldn't really understand what the cause of it is, and much less produce the desire that to become free from that cause and its consequent result. So that again is why this sequence is given in the way it is.
Oh yeah. 다되네 미스비시에서 다 사전에는 이 풍부 동아지 저와 되게 그 동아 네 치제라 안에 집이 동안 가위 동안 나유 동안 치위 동안 동아지 동안 주유 동안 어디다 차원 두세 동아라 내 마대바 인장 동아지 님이 삼네 안에 동아라 다되지 로제와나 사전일이 풍보텔라 다되지 로제와나 풍보대당 라와 천니삼미니 아니 사전일이 이 풍보텔라 주여다 매 주태양 다갑니다 냠도 아니 다 주태라 도바체 군주라 도바체 아니 가서래 동아랑경 어디 아니 다 참았다만 하시 안 보면 봐 도바체디 동아랑경 어디 아니 참았던 봐 신도 보면 봐 토메셔 야
Now, likewise, when the desire to be free from suffering has arisen, one realizes or understands that one either can or cannot become free from this suffering, and that the suffering either does or does not have a cause, and one realizes that in relation to origination, the cause is considered either to be permanent or impermanent, and so one has to, I think I've gotten ahead of that, I'm sorry. No, I've gotten ahead of myself in the translation here, sorry. So through initially thinking about the general and particular disadvantages of samsara, one must generate the mind that desires to be free from that, because if that desire does not come first, it is impossible that there will arise the desire to abandon the cause of suffering. So what this is referring to then is that we, first of all, identify what suffering is, which, as we've said, is the aggregates, which are the contaminated aggregates. Now, the contaminated aggregates themselves are pervaded by this nature of being created by karma and mental affliction. That is, there's no condition of the five contaminated aggregates which is not pervaded by that basic character of suffering, the most pervasive or all-encompassing nature of suffering to be created by karma and mental affliction. Once one is in that, when that state of being created by karma and mental affliction, then one necessarily is subject to the suffering of transformation. And then once one is subject to the suffering of transformation, one necessarily is subject to gross forms of suffering, pain and hunger, thirst, and so forth. So in terms of the subtlety of the levels of suffering, it's the first of these, the pervasive nature of being created by karma and mental affliction, which is the most fundamental. So we have to understand that first in order to be able to understand in turn what it is that gives rise to samsara, the contaminated aggregates, because it's this wisdom that realizes or rather the misconception of the self is the principal cause which gives rise to the misconception, or is the underlying conception, which is upon which is based that pervasive nature of being created by the karma and by contaminated karma and mental affliction, because karma and mental affliction arise out of that misconception that grasps at or adheres to the self as being existing in a way in which it does not.
Oh yeah, that didn't do you that meta. 주태야 따가 메다 따바나 아니 다 사전이 풍부 동아디 차와디 그 동아디 주대 레다니 뭐니 아니 주 홍어시 제제 레당 대이 레당 아니 니몽그 그날라데 제와 레다니 뭐니고 티주 콘도 치네 아니 군주라 본데지 로디 제베 군주데 아니 동아디 비체수 아니 군주데 바레스 아니 가서래 동아지 주 아니 니모 본에서 통바나 군중 본에서 통하나 아니 다 주군중 반배 저 동아 관에서 통화주 그랬어 저 동아 관에서 통화주와 걔네 아니 동아 다바기 과바 온데 전에서 주 군중 본에서 통해서 통해 Jugabe do dobe, do doba juba yinza, and the Dunga Gaba Goba on the Chinese Tongue, Goba de, and it is about the Tabare, Tambo Dunga, Niwa Kunju, Sumba Goba Tisaba Tabare. And it Dunga Babu Goba on the Cheba Lion, and it was a Dunga Jupambaki, Ponjaki Lam, Nimbo, Damon was in the Tavilam. Undi chebe lam tenju kombale anu goba toko wa yinzang ra leba towe anu gobi chesu lam jitaba oda gyune teji kasi yujang oba tobe rimbe wangdo chena adu stembare tam.
So through having thought in that way, and then realized that it's essential to become free from suffering, and the only suffering which is the 5 contaminated aggregates, samsara, and then realizing that when you understand that there is when that desire is arisen, one realizes that one either can or cannot become free from this suffering, and suffering either does or does not have a cause. And one realizes that that in fact there is a cause, and that in relation to origination, the origination of suffering, that cause is considered to be either permanent or impermanent. When one considers the causality of suffering in that way, one sees that one cannot dispose of the essence of suffering, or the basic character of suffering, the way that one pulls out a thorn. It's not something that you can just remove like that. When one examines it in that way, one understands that the cause of suffering is twofold: karma and the mental afflictions, or defilement. It's being translated as defilements here, but I'm using mental afflictions. And when there arises a mind that desires to abandon those, then that is origination. That origination, that's what's taught as second. When one sees that one is able to abandon the origination, the origination of suffering arises from this misapprehension of the self, or grasping at a self as being real, then one sees that one is able to affect that cessation of suffering, which is through the means to do that, which is the path which realizes selflessness. And therefore, when one sees that the active power of that cessation that stops suffering, this is cessation, which is taught as the third.
Oh yeah, that's it. Kaji kite yonggo de, doa yang tolong kuni. Ta tui tambo dunga gani se tona. Ani duba dunga gaba on de cheko, dunga goni se na dunga gaba on de Chinese tonwe, a tonwe chapgres. De yinzang dunga ge jisu gaba kunju ma deba, ani gaba tinyu wa dengo de rilas. Yang kunju boni se tona, dunga goni se tong gwe, ani kunju dunga ji nga denba resource. O kongo kore da, kunju dunga yi kore nga denba de resource. Kunju boni se tong yang, ani dame toba la ra lebe, toma denba chawa ni yinbe, chige shebi denshi kore mange so xena, dali kaji kidoba de, dali le ma jaya pare.
Now, so the conclusion of that is that which directly affects that cessation, which it causes it to come into effect, is taught as the path. And when one gains a basic understanding, or roughly sees what is to be accustomated, that is how one develops or conditions oneself to the path, then that is the path which is taught as the fourth of the Four Noble Truths. So now someone might come back with some question of this, and they might say that one sees in the first place that one is able to affect the cessation of suffering. Since one necessarily sees the active power that stops suffering, it would be reasonable to teach cessation second. And when one has seen that one is able to abandon origination, since one must be able to affect that cessation of suffering, it would be reasonable to teach cessation realization before suffering's origination. Since initially one is to be taught roughly that a realization of no self is seen to enable one to abandon the origination of suffering, then the ordering of the truths as explained is uncertain. So they're basically questioning that order of presentation, saying that because of the way that these things are understood is different, then there's a discrepancy between the sequence in which they're taught and the way they should be taught.
Oh yeah, that thing your maris carries and a that carries or a chili chawa kanda kanda yang, chawatella jubala, chawatella jubagi, and a payam goa de tomata. Ani chawatella dobala, chawatella dobagi, yemi, going to tomala ralia grace. Chawati dobala, yemi, and tong, I know, tell dobala. Chawatella dobala, Chawatella jubi, yemi down, gain the tone, Chawatella dogova. Chawatella jubi, pine the tone, Chawatella jugova. What the hell ever is? There is a Kochi down, Cheraki yemi. Kochi dunga truksambala sawa. Cheraki yemi, and the draw sosi dunga yemi sambe. And the Koadilla may turn to tone, Madon that to tone, may turn to Luanashi, tone, tell and Radiji, Lord Tamshi, Tambojava Igis. The December or Janis Toma Maris, Dunga the Janis Coamino. Ketan Tini were Kunju Bonis with Sama Toma Yelas, Tini were Dunga Tombi Jesu, and you could tell Tini were Kunju Bonis with Sama Toma Yela. Kunju Bonis with Sama Tomana, Tetovana, and you go on to Chinese Tongue, and you could use Tini were the Goba Tusubatemba Rixo landing.
Now, the reply to that is that this needs to be explained as it is, as it has been explained in that sequence, and we can demonstrate this or explain this as follows. In general, whenever one's in any kind of situation, one sees the benefits of engaging in some kind of action or entering into certain actions, and sees roughly the disadvantages of the reverse of that, or one could say that in any kind of case, when whatever one's engaging in, whatever kind of activity one's engaged in, at the beginning, at the first, we see what are the benefits of doing it, and what are the disadvantages of that. And so that comes about as an initial process of any kind of activity that we're engaged in, or thinking about engaging in. When one thinks about the general and particular disadvantages, defects of samsara, then one sees samsara as if it was a fiery pit, a pit of fire. One generates first just the mind that desires to be free from that. So initially by thinking about samsara, in the sort of general defects of it, disadvantages of it, as well as the specific, all the different forms of suffering within it. And then when we contemplate that carefully, we come to an understanding that samsara, the general condition of samsara, is like a fiery pit. So we gain first that kind of understanding. And then from that recognition, we desire to be free from that. But at that initial point, we don't realize that we are able to be free from that. We don't see that there is actually a way in which we can become free from that.
Oh yeah, that that condo casa using over Dobby, but the Tumba, the Toma, Duma Demba, Tene Kunjun Demba, Tene Goba Demba, Lam Demba, or Tendiki, any casa using over Dobby, but the Tumba, Naju, Gila, Desi, let me be Tonam Javanaya, Corum, Rumba Corum Teta Tumba Javares, Tonam Javana, Rumba Teta Tumba Javamasa, Toma. 또비림발라 대시 또비림발라 또비림 kamala야 아야 토마 동아템바 테네 오타다 오테 군중 고바 다템바 티주장 오바토 베림바 찾다템바 아니 또 그래 나주 뒤라 뎀바실라 메베 토나 제와나 그러면 찾다템바 제와 마세 토마 대시 또베네가라야 그러면 찾다템바 아니 또 바자고 그래서
Now, so then once you've gained that kind of understanding that samsara is like a fiery pit, but you haven't determined at that point if there is a way to get free from that, then in the second phase you see with authority or like through means of valid cognition, inference initially and then subsequently through direct perception, that one is able to abandon origination. When one sees that, since one sees the active power of cessation, it is reasonable to teach origination second and cessation third. And then, as was described previously, the path is taught at the end as the means by which cessation is to be actualized. Thus, when the path of seeing that has as its object the Four Noble Truths arises in the mind stream of a yogin or yogini, it arises in accordance with that ordering. So we have to say, not only in that kind of circumstance, when one gains a direct perceptual realization of the Four Noble Truths, that it arises in that sequence, but it's also the case that earlier in the stage of when one is developing just a regular initial intellectual or conceptual understanding of this, when gaining the understanding of this through hearing and thinking about it as well, comes about through understanding the Four Noble Truths in the sequence in which they've been given.
Oh yeah. 다 되네 천시되라 가들에 sana 동아 그 천시라 동아 때문에 아니 다다 감미 숙세라 쏘와 아니 동아지 동아라 감미 숙세라 쏘여 초와니 초와 동아 아니 동아지 동아탐 아니 세 이동와라 라바세네 로냐외 초와 네 아니 다 가서래 동아디 주의 동아 아니 때 가서래 동아중 올 주와 연장 패신바이 대화라 또바 주와 대대바 대다 동아 패신라 또바 주와 매스 다시 시와 나시 전에 사제 그 초원 대화데 아니 가서래 다른 아니 가서 동아공 오를 주와 요와 인산 된다와데 주의 동아 서래 와 동아 칠치에 와라 사제 그 초원 대화데 동아 칠치에 와라 대화랑 뭐봐 잠마도 제비 동아 칠치에 와라 아니 대화랑 뭐봐 저와 꼼비 동아 칠치에 와라 대화랑 뭐봐 잠마도 랑시지 대화 지와 말에세 랑시지 요나 대화 지요나 아니 동아 같이 동나야 랑시지 대화요 안 대화 요거 태매봐 동아공 오르 주와 인자 대송과래 와 세계도요 라라바세나 로냐외 초와서 오니 주의 동화탕스 다더니 가랑지 내년기 왕그 총위 내년기 라텔샤 라텔이 샤베 사자니이 부부 강인 바 탐제 아니 되시 그 동화세 다 됨바래 가서래 되시 동화대 이자 동화 곰세서 저데 사자니이 풍부대 동화제 라신도 소화지 고고하래 와 되시 동화라고네 되시 동화라고데 동화 관바송 바행세 아니 동화지 동화다 주 동화라 아니 이중 제바 동화지 동화 이중 제바 텐들라야 요야 말에 와 동화라 이중 제바데 아니 싫어와나 요바 나도 이중 제사做的 가와래 세나 아니 사전일이 풍부도 도시 그 동화들 이중 제와지 고와 말에 다 做的이중 제사지 두된 개념이 쌓여 어 인자 강의 탐제 동화 풍부 사제지 풍부 강의 탐제 도시지 동화대 대탐제 동화지 담아오
Now there are illustrations or kind of explanation of what the Four Noble Truths are, sort of illustrating them and giving examples of them. So for example, I'm going to modify the translation in this section a little bit, but so like a current sensation of pain, etc. in the kidneys is the suffering of suffering, or suffering of suffering is a repetitive compound, just means suffering in general, ordinary suffering. This next one is the sensation resulting from an excessive craving for delicious food is the suffering of change. That translation needs to be modified, and it's I think a better translation there is that the suffering of change or the suffering of transformation is the sensation which arises from experiencing the taste, and when one has excessive craving for some kind of delicious or attractive food. So it's the sensation of the taste which one experiences when one is tasting some kind of delicious or attractive food. So what that is referring to is that sensation of taste itself is a kind of contaminated sensation. The sensation, because of the extreme attachment one feels for it, one has that attachment contaminates the sensation to make it a kind of contaminated sensation, and that experience itself of that contaminated sensation, even though it's nominally pleasurable, that is, worldly beings consider that pleasure, but if one examines it more carefully, it's actually of the nature of suffering. The reason it's of the nature of suffering is that if it was real pleasure or real happiness, then the more one experienced that sensation, if one can just continue to experience that sensation constantly and increasingly, it would, if it was real pleasure, it would maintain that pleasurable quality. But if one was to experience that nominally or conventionally pleasurable sensation for an extended period of time, if one just continued to indulge in that sensation constantly for a long period of time, it would transform or change into suffering, something which a sensation or experience which would be conventionally understood to be suffering. So that's what it means by the suffering of transformation or change. And then all contaminated aggregates on which are placed or which are the outcome of the imprints of karma and the defilements or mental afflictions are suffering pervading formations. I would again translate that a little bit differently by saying that so the whatever it is among the contaminated aggregates, which are the outcome of the karma and mental afflictions, contaminated karma and mental afflictions are the suffering of being created by karma and mental afflictions. So all of these are the truth of suffering. Now, the most important, in a sense, the most important or essential one of these is the third, that is, the suffering of being a creation of the karma, contaminated karma and mental affliction, is the most fundamental and is the one that we should attempt to achieve renunciation of, because the ordinary suffering, developing revulsion towards that or a sort of renunciation of that, that's common to animals. Even animals don't want to experience those kinds of sensations and suffering experiences like that. And then the suffering of transformation, which is recognition that conventional pleasure has a sort of fundamentally suffering nature, is even non-Buddhist practitioners, yogis and yoginis who wish to achieve their kind of liberation have renunciation of that. But the suffering which, a recognition that the suffering of being created by karma and mental affliction is fundamental to the two former forms of suffering, And that's the real object or the most fundamental aspect of suffering that one needs to develop that kind of renunciation of.
Oh yeah, that is la. Sabata chebe ledan. You bottom ya kujun damba yela serikala. Sabata chebe lesana. And the drawer to your pension ledan. Drawer to Boto, your pension ledan. I need to castle let go on the Jew and Mario Batang. I let you go on to Mario Batang. Ani leji turchi de juvi ani sebata lemba o tinzo ani nyemo tham kunjung de bare nyemo tham kunjung de bare sungo ma ta de ro le da nyemo ba tham che se do sim ba to do wa ru to penje yi ani ru bu kan penje gi le te da dang ani le te da go kulon ju ma ru ba dang ani je won ru chi gi sebata lemba我得到你们的，你们得到，俺们滚给他把赢了。东岸高边查完呢，那东岸高边查完呢，高边单把，那东岸前些怎么回事的吧？东岸高边查完呢，俺呢东岸查完就是给东岸人洗为你洗，俺查完的高边单把汤。你是的，超级的，俺呢咱们我说特别写了，咱们就单把，我写了的，咱们就单把。我到前些怎么着呢？俺那东岸电把、古晋电把、国巴电把、南电把，在前些咱们都行吧的。
Now then, the second of the Four Noble Truths, the origin of suffering, is the truth of origin is all of the karma which is contaminated, specifically contaminated karma, and mental afflictions. So within so any kind of activity or karma that we engage in, which is contaminated, meaning have sort of the outgrowth of the mental afflictions, is of the nature of suffering and is the source of suffering, the origin of suffering. So any kind of karma then that is the direct cause of being reborn into any of the 6 realms of samsara, and it produces those, is definitely the source of suffering. Then, as far as all mental afflictions are concerned, all of the mental afflictions that impel us to engage in actions, contaminated actions, and particularly the contaminated mind of craving and grasping, which are sort of the direct activators of rebirth within the 6 realms of samsara. Those are of the nature, the source of suffering. And then within, sort of fundamental to all of those is again the misconception or misapprehension of the self as existing in some fashion in which it doesn't, grasping at a self in a way that it doesn't actually exist. So all of those are the source of or origin of suffering. And then the sort of definition of the truth of cessation refers to the separation from the causes of suffering, the origin of suffering, as well as the origination of suffering and suffering itself. So that separation, or which is the cessation of suffering as well as its causes, is a kind of the definition in a way of the truth of cessation, nirvana, and all of the subdivisions of it, and then the path to the cessation of suffering is particularly focuses on the wisdom which is direct perceptual or direct realization of selflessness. These are just giving sort of definitions of these things.
Oh yeah, that is it. 他说的，希望劳动集中的生活，是这，劳动集中的生呢，俺呢，台长高原那么集中的生活是，那劳动集中看的是嘞，是那东岸个老板大把西，东岸的了， 대단가 남바 시카라 동안데라 동안가 체제들의 시요인 말에 미다바 동아와 동아 다음에 봤어. 미다베 체제 아니 가서 동안데베 체제 미다바다 동아와다 동아다 다음에 봐 시워 태기 로쇼 증겐데라 아니 로쇼데라 텔라 로바 쇼와데라 아니 땅데 다다도 좀 봤어. 그래와 동안 로바 쇼와데라 미사와라 땅와 좀 봐. 동안라 대화 쯤바 미다발라 다바 쯤바 나도 마두발라 다도 쯤바 시고시고데 다도 쯤바래 와 다디 미사말라 장와 쯤바세데 카르레 데 카르 로실 샤고아레 사나 동와 로실 샤고아레 미다 동아 동 다음에 시시어와 특징에를 더나 동와 라쇼 아나 미다비 로실데 다바 쯤바치 다바체 당지 미다비로 아니 동아기 로슈데라 대화체 다 미자마라 장와 점바데 간사 미자메 제 소주 강외 강사데 아니 가소래 다당 텐데비 다당 아풍풍고 타데도 점바 대 동비 로셔라샤 아니 다도 마두와 다도 주와데 아니 다음에 그러셔라샤 되게 장와단 대화단 다바다 다도 점바시 미다베 로셔시 미다바기 동아데베 체주리 시위 아니 미다 동아 동 다음에 시켜로 슈테체 다 군중 야 로바슈바 군중 대바 내다니 뭐니 봐야 군중 동아 그 주래다니 뭐니 다 동아 규매도 점바 아니 동아 미디미 주지 많이 미디미 주래 껴와 미디미 주와지 안줄래 껴와 달라야 유치권에 껴와 좀 받아 아니 왕주라 소와 아니 현지 리온도 단에 껴와 좀 봐. 이제 미디미 주처럼 동아 규매 줘더라. 되니 라신 따라 내가 아니 내가 주어 좀 봐.
Now, there are distorted ideas or misconceptions, erroneous ideas about the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths are subdivided into each of them have four aspects, four properties or sort of dimensions. So these 16, first of all, are identified 16 erroneous, or really they're the opposite of what they actually are, notions about the Four Noble Truths, and then identifying the actual 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, which are the opposite of those, the correct way in which to understand the Four Noble Truths. So with respect to suffering, there are four misconceptions or ideas, holding it to be pure, pleasurable, permanent, and finally related to a self. So the first misconception, holding suffering to be pure, whereas in reality it is impure. Suffering is of its basic nature is impurity. And then second, holding it to be pleasurable, misconceiving or thinking that what is really of the nature of suffering is of the nature of pleasure, is pleasurable in its character. And then grasping at it or misapprehending, holding it to be permanent, suffering to be permanent, is the opposite of understanding it correctly as being impermanent. And then finally, misconceiving the samsara or the suffering as being related to a self is the opposite of the correct understanding that it is selfless. So within these, the sequence of presentation is a little bit different than the order in which the 16 positive or correct aspects of the origin of suffering are presented but they come down to covering the same area. And where it says that it's pure, that misconception that it is pure is the opposite of holding that which is of the nature of that pertains to the self, is misconceiving it as being pure. And then the other three correlate to the other three aspects of the Four Noble Truths. Now, the distorted ideas about origination, the source of suffering are two. Holding that suffering is causeless, is without any kind of cause, and holding that the cause is something inappropriate, meaning something that couldn't really serve as a cause. And with respect to this latter misconception or distorted idea, it would be the idea that there's a single cause that gives rise to some suffering, or to hold that some kind of result, suffering as a result, is the result of the mind of some other person or being, such as Ishvara or God, etc. And then, or holding that something whose nature is permanent can change according to circumstances. That is, that if there was some kind of creator God that created samsara, that samsara itself could change according to various extrinsic circumstances, even though the God that creates it is a permanent, unchanging kind of being.
Oh yeah, that is la, Goba ke lo shu de la, Goba siwa chanwa nge ju shi ke ngo de lo shu de la. Ani tarba yeme tu zimba. Ini bambi bamba tarba yeme tu zimba. Ana dunga chawa du ji ke dunga nyawa siwi tarba yeme tu zimba. Ani saje ji cheba gashi tarba zimba se de. Ani panjang unju wa gashi bamba ke. Ani cheba gashi tarba zimba. Dunga ji cheba gashi ani 찬업이 타바침바 아니 동아 세바 여장 동아 때나 도바 매바 짐바데 어지 시체가나 고바라 로슈 고바시와 찬업 내준식이 로슈 시체 디제라 람두방 내지 아니 람르바 두방 내지 시기 아니 데라 아니 탈람 예매 듣점바 남긴 도저 리바기 도저라 아니 담에 콤바래 아니 남도 메리 받점바 콤바 남도 메리 받점바 남리바 누바게 삼대지 개바 가시 탈람 듣점바 와 삼대지 용시 가시 아니 동안에 와시 문주와르시 밤바게 아니 삼대지 개바 가시 탈람 듣점바 남리바 두바 아니 동안라 메도베 체전 메비 아니 체전라 동안 메도베 체전도 세베 라메바 츠바 동안 어디 두바게 응신게 아니 참 로셔신 바래.
Now then, with respect to cessation, there are distorted ideas about cessation, which is holding that liberation never comes about, or one could say is totally non-existent, that there's no such thing as liberation. Holding liberation, misapprehending liberation to be some particular contaminated state, meaning that even if one has gotten rid of some portion of the contaminated mental afflictions, if there's some residual mental afflictions left, then one has nevertheless achieved a state of liberation. So that liberation has some residual contamination within it. Or three, holding liberation is some kind of sublime state that is freedom from some particular kind of suffering. That is, like if you've gotten rid of some particular certain form of suffering, then that's liberation, even though actually you haven't gotten rid of all forms of suffering. And then holding that even if suffering is eliminated, it can return. That's the fourth of the four misconceptions that relate to the truth of cessation. Then distorted ideas about the path are holding that the path to liberation doesn't exist or never comes about, holding that it is unreasonable to assert that the path to liberation is accustomation or conditioning oneself, meditating on selflessness, no self, holding that the path to liberation is merely some kind of special form of meditative absorption, that's the path to liberation, and then holding that there's no kind of dharmic path that cannot revert to suffering, that there's no that there's nothing that that something which operates as a path, but that doesn't have that quality of irreversibility is the path to suffering, to freedom from suffering.
Oh yeah, that digi lo shu ju zhong ge song de pa chen chen ne, da lo shu ju zu de ge ani ka shui de na ba ju zu de, 是吧？那么居住的，那没大把的东啊，我的东啊的大没把的东啊给那把西，是吧？没大东啊东大没西的东啊给那把西的把的，他的呢，我的他啥些年东啊一东啊人家人，啥些年的风波人那人，他谈不没大把的住，是吧？谈不没大把，现在东啊哇。 人家东把出国人家，他啥些年的碰碰么东啊的，没大把人的，是吧？人家机会大了，没大把出，是吧？没大把，人家机会起来了是，哦，没大把人的，人家机会起来了是，没大把团的让出队的，这些你话没大把的，没大把团把的，是吧？没大把是啊，你，他的呢，哦。 东啊，我人的，但连有个想法建议不起来，连有个想法建议不起来。东北人的是，但往脚不大，这种还是个掌握个老久了，这就看了，没上为这收入康为往脚不大的当，啊，碰不牛我对天线去东北人当，我东北人的往脚不大，天线没不起来是。 你东北人，他当没把的，让我打工我，看啥让我，人家为打工我，没出把一张，俺那当没把的，人家他的电视车去修的，东海这边车去修的，没大被打了在那东海中，东海打了在那，俺那看说的东北中，东北打了在那，俺那当没把中，都是车干了，这个的，
Now then, the correct understanding of the Four Noble Truths and the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths which contradict those misconceptions, distorted ideas given above. The suffering of suffering is impermanent because it occurs occasionally. It is suffering because it is dependent on karma and mental affliction. And it is void or empty because there is no objectively existing separate self that governs or controls it. It is without self because it does not exist in the nature of an independent self. There's no autonomous self which exists such that it could be sort of the governor or something that exists apart from the aggregates. Now. So it's impermanent. So we can prove that suffering is impermanent because it occurs occasionally. This applies to both the suffering of suffering as well as the suffering of transformation. Or these we can observe that they occur sometimes and sometimes they don't manifest in a gross way. So that establishes that once they come into being, that particular event doesn't perpetuate into a second moment. It could be replaced with a similar moment of the same type of suffering, but it's not permanent in the sense of enduring more than a single moment. So it is suffering because it is dependent on karma and mental affliction, contaminated karma and mental affliction. We can show that it is void or empty because there is no objectively separate self This would say that there's no self outside of the aggregates which controls them and somehow is the dominator, that autonomous being that controls the aggregates. And then it is also fourth, without a self, because it does not exist in the nature of an independent self. So even within the aggregates, if we're looking for within them, there's no autonomous self that exists within or without them.
Oh yeah, it's没大整个基本大当，两年跟小王给建，两年跟小王建起大了蛋呢，俺那东啊准备吃就当不住吧。大天年了，在那滚大去学院那把这边东啊准备吃就当不住了是。大天年，咱没大把当，俺那两年跟小王建起大了，俺那人个基本大了。是吧？没大天年了，滚大去学院那把这边东啊准备吃就当不住是。当吧，你打，咱们打让我用我嘛住吧，但是让我打他当，就当他在看到的嘛住呗打了，你打没住呗，他就送过来没的，他订拿来要嘛，对我都通过几千嘛，打天年了，但那是呢，没打巴当，你东啊别打了，但呢，你跟那个学院那把结巴噻，他就行吧。可是刚说没认为在苏州岗位，让为大太当，碰不牛的，我太多，准备怎么的。
So now then, we can look at these all together as collectively establishing the non-existence of an autonomous or independent self, because we can establish that things are impermanent, suffering is impermanent because it occurs occasionally, and this is something we can see just perceptually or obviously. It is we can see that it infer from that it is suffering because it is dependent upon karma, contaminated karma, and mental affliction. And so these two factors or aspects of the truth of suffering can then in turn demonstrate that there's no objectively separate self that controls it, that controls our aggregates, because if there was an objectively, that is a self which had sort of control over the aggregates, they were able to control them, then we wouldn't see the gross suffering which is arising all the time, and we wouldn't see the karma and mental affliction which produce all of the suffering. This kind of so the aggregates and there's no such thing as a self which is objectively separate or independent of the aggregates that has dominion over them. So this that kind of inference based upon impermanence and suffering, these two aspects of the truth of suffering, serve as evidence which is negates the misconception. This is something that would be conceptually contrived or fabricated by some kind of philosophical view. It's not something that's sort of natural to us, but that there's a self which is separate from our aggregates and is kind of in control of them. So that negates that. And then likewise, we're able to infer based on that evidence that there's no autonomous self. Here, the fourth of the four aspects here, selflessness is established because the aggregates are impermanent and of the nature of suffering. And that it can serve as evidence that the self as it's misconceived, either through some kind of artificial conceptual process of imagining a self, or the sort of innate notion of a self which is holding it to be autonomous or existing in that way, those can be eliminated also from understanding impermanence and suffering, that evidence for them. And this comes in more detail later on. We'll stop there for today.
Sashi Bukti Jukshin Meto Pram River Cleanshin Yide Kempati Sunday Singdu Mikte Buaki Rupanam Dakshin Lochapash Oki Dam Guru Andala Kwam
yo